So today we continue our journey through the executive branch by looking at a phenomenon known as gridlock, which is to an extent unique to our presidential system. I say to an extent because it is possible in a parliamentary system. It's just highly unlikely for the reasons we've already described, namely that the executive and the legislative in a parliamentary system go hand in hand because the executive is selected by the legislative. And almost certainly they're in the same majority party or at least the same majority coalition. Now, it does not guarantee that you won't have gridlock because, of course, coalitions are notoriously unstable. Plus, on top of that, you may be dealing with incredibly small majorities. But by and large, the parliamentary system is immune to gridlock, and just consequentially, our system seems to have become at least prone to it. So why is that? Well, part of the answer to that question goes to a reading that you guys should have, if the sequencing of this course remains as it should be, just finished. And that was The Personal Presidency as described by Theodore Lowy. Side note, if you study political science in college at all, your odds of having to read Lowy at some point are somewhere in the rough neighborhood of really, really freaking high. So for those of you who either didn't read it, shame upon you, or have forgotten the salient details, modestly less shame upon you, the theory is that that since the days of FDR, okay, up till FDR, you might wonder why Lowy picked him. Up until FDR, it simply needs to be said that it was fundamentally very difficult for the president to offer his beliefs, his positions, his message to the American voter without going through the filter of the media. That changes with Roosevelt. Why? Because Roosevelt has the radio. Little known fact, he had already learned fairly well before he got to the White House how to harness radio. He used it to fairly good effect when he was governor of New York for the 4 years prior to his stint as president. Now, something a lot of people don't know about the fireside chats that became famous under Roosevelt is he did not employ them that often. Over the entire course of his presidency, he only did a couple dozen. He did, 2, 3, 4 a year. 4 a year was, I think, the maximum year, and I think that was in the first year of his presidency. And that was actually really smart because it allowed him to communicate things and also at the same time make them important. If he gave a fireside chat every week, it would become routine. There'd be nothing special about it. So when the message came that the president was going to be speaking on the radio, it became a destination event. People tuned in because they knew something important was going to be said because, again, it wasn't done every week or twice a week or once every other week. It wasn't done on a set schedule at all. The first one was almost immediately after he was inaugurated, and then there wasn't another one for 2 months. And then there wasn't another one for a month or two after that, and then there wasn't one until the fall. So FDR, by using the fireside chat, what he did, and this is what Lowy notes, is it allows him to communicate directly to the voters without the filter of the press interpreting what his proposals were and offering, whether directly or indirectly, their opinion on it. He just went straight to the voters via the radio. So presidents are using this persuasive skill they now have to talk directly to the voters, to bypass the media filter, and the fact that they have a higher profile, something we'll get to in just a second on the next slide, to make what Lowy calls a new social contract with the citizenry. Vote for me, or continue to vote for me, work on my behalf, and I will deliver the policies you want. You and I together. I mean, this is the implicit message. Certainly of the fireside chats and most presidential persuasion. Whether it's today, it might be through Twitter or Instagram, but 100 years ago or 90 years ago was the fireside chat. The implicit message is you and I will work together to get the policies we want. So the president, puts himself on the side of the citizenry against this monolith known as government, which is an effective way to get elected and then to get reelected. What it is not is an effective way to create a good and happy synergy with Congress, because the one inherent flaw in this system, this personal presidency as Lowy describes it, well, there's actually a couple. Not on the screen, but as we talked about when we talked about the personal presidency, if you read the article, the biggest flaw in the personal presidency is it tends to cause presidents to overpromise. If you just vote for me or you continue to support me, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll do this and that. And it tends to make them promise more than they could ever realistically hope to deliver. The second problem with the system, though, is it does pit the president and Congress as adversaries rather than partners. And that's true even if they belong to the same party. Roosevelt will wind up offering more vetoes than any president in American history. And we think historically at some of the congressional relationships with presidents, whether you're talking about Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction, or you're talking about Jackson with the Congress that thought that he was becoming King Andrew because he expanded the power of the president beyond what anybody had seen to that point. Neither of them proportionally offered more vetoes than Roosevelt did per year. Now, this creates a certain level of tension. But research tells us why this relationship would happen the way it does. And when you look at it through that lens, it actually, to be honest with you, it does make a certain level of sense. Consider. Presidents as a singular figure are almost always more popular than Congress, the entity. Now, we talked about this last chapter. But just to remind you, individual members of Congress may be liked at home. We don't really have the need to, nor the infrastructure to pull individual House races very often. Sometimes they do if the race is particularly competitive and one of the campaigns chooses to pay for it. But polling isn't cheap. A quality poll, even a very cheap quality poll, is going to cost you probably anywhere between $15,000 to $30,000. You can get them cheaper than that, but they're not worth the paper they're printed on in most cases. A quality poll is going to cost you at least $30,000, probably more. Most House campaigns aren't going to spring money for that unless they absolutely have to, and most don't. But presumably, if we were to poll our congressional district here, Ted Lieu's approval rating would probably be higher than Biden's. I'd be very comfortable making that bet. But we're talking about Congress as a body, as an institution. And as we discovered last chapter, that approval rating is ass. It's terrible. It's junk, right? On a good day, it's right around 30%. Whereas if you look at Biden, his worst numbers have been in the very high 30s. 37, 38, 39, except for a couple outlier polls that were even lower than that. But generally speaking, if you look at polling averages, which you always should, 39 has been kind of the low point. Might have snuck to 38, but I don't even think it did that. Meanwhile, Congress, if everything goes right there at 30, right? Would we say the average was something like 18 or 22 or something like that? Something awful. So Congress can use, the president can use Congress as a foil. I will get them to do what we want. That's sort of the message inherent in the personal presidency. But again, if you create an adversary on the other side, it can create gridlock because Congress, especially if what's being proposed is something that might inhibit Congress in some way. Let's say, for example, by the way, I'm going to lay you behind the wall here. If you see me take a delay, it's because I have a beverage here in front of me because this is being recorded summer of 23, and it's already about 80 degrees or better outside. And they built my house, our back bedroom where my office is and where our bedroom is, without insulation. So it gets very hot very quickly. So if I had to guess on an internal temperature in here right now, it's probably about 86, 87 degrees. So yeah, it's warm. Now, enough of the weather and sports. Let's get back to the news. When you're looking at Congress, sometimes what the president is promising is things that get in the way of the prerogatives of Congress. For example, just to give one, if you have a conservative president who is promising to cut the budget, so that he could ready up a big tax cut for the American people. Well, Congress loves to do tax cuts. They're very politically popular. But they're not necessarily fans of cutting spending. Because some of the spending that's inevitably going to get cut is that spending, that pork barrel spending that we talked about last unit, when we talked about the advantages that incumbent congressmen hold. And that spending is jobs in their district. They don't want to give that up. So there's just one example where gridlock could be created by the president promising A and it digging into the prerogatives of Congress and Congress fighting back. But there's actually a simpler reason for gridlock in the modern era beyond just the personal presidency. And that is for the bulk of your lifetime for sure, and certainly the bulk of my lifetime at this point, gridlock has been created by a divided government. A divided government is defined as a Congress of one party. Now, let me be clear on terms here. Okay, if you listen to nothing else, make this clear, because otherwise you're going to be confused a lot as we go forward. When we talk about a divided government, it does not mean inherently that both houses of Congress have to be of party X. Take right now. You have a Democratic president, President Biden. You have a Democratic-controlled Senate. But you have a Republican-controlled House. That is divided government. There's no, well, they've got 2 out of 3. No, that doesn't matter. Because as you should know by now, and if you don't, damn, any piece of legislation has to pass both chambers of Congress. So the Republican majority in the House is going to create a divided government, because the likelihood that they're just going to simply go along with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president is fantasy. It's not going to happen very often, hardly at all, in fact. And as I noted earlier in the week, I noted when we talked about presidents and prime ministers, in our system, divided government's actually become increasingly common. Since 1980, just so you can have an explicit statistic, we've had divided government 72% of the time, 31 out of 43 years. Now, what used to drive divided government was a phenomenon known as split-ticket voting. And this was drawn from a mistrust of government, a belief that the parties were not dramatically far apart. And so people felt no real internal problem with voting for a Republican president and a Democrat for Congress, or vice versa. Split-ticket voting became increasingly common after the 1940s, reached its peak in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But it must be said, because we believe in accuracy here, has dropped dramatically since the year 2000. Why? Because we've become more polarized. Lots of reasons why, and we're going to talk more about that when we talk about ideology a little bit later. But to give you sort of the Spark Notes version here right now, you have now a decentralized media. You have a media that is configured in a way that you can consume information without ever having to have your priors, your beliefs questioned at all. My father-in-law, very conservative. He lives off of, Facebook political threads that, go viral and get passed around by person to person. Actually, one of the leading producers of viral content on Facebook is Ben Shapiro. It's stuff based off his radio show, I believe. So he does, the social media, right-wing, viral threads that everybody's, aunts and grandpas seem to get. And if he's watching TV and it's not a sporting event, it's Fox News. Or the Sci-Fi Channel, because he's into that. But point is, he will never hear a balanced portrayal of political news. Because he doesn't want to, and now he doesn't have to. He can go to his social media and get his information there. And he can get, and he's old enough that I think he still gets like the chain emails about this stuff, the newsletters as they call them, or you can tune into Fox News. Now, if you've got an old, unreconstructed, hippie liberal grandma or grandpa, same deal. They're going to listen to NPR, although NPR, to keep their federal contracts, will occasionally air conservative content, but obviously more often than not they don't. Or they go to particular liberal websites, or they watch John Oliver, they watch The Daily Show and Jon Stewart was on there, etc., etc. So you have your outlets. So why do we still have divided government? Well, the answer now is we've become so polarized that split-ticket voting has largely disappeared, but every election's a toss-up. Michael Barone, the conservative political scientist who used to write the Almanac of American Politics, he now still edits it, but I don't think he actively writes it anymore. Michael Barone wrote a great essay, actually, for the Almanac of American Politics about 10 years ago, called The 49% Nation. And he's not entirely wrong. Let's just look at the elections since 2000 in the United States. I'm going to give you the winning percentage for the presidential candidate. 49%, 51%, 53%, 51%, 46%, 51%. Now you go back in history. Every now and again, at least, you get a blowout. 1984. Reagan beats Walter Mondale 59% to 40%, I think it was. Even 80, the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, gets beat 51% to 41%. But you look at what the losers have gotten since 2000, and it's 49%. Because remember, that one was effectively tied. That was the Gore-Bush election. 48%, 45%, 47%, 48%. Because remember, that was the election where Clinton actually got more popular votes than Trump did. And then the last election, Trump got 47%. So we haven't had a candidate really even get in the low 40s since 1996. I'd just gotten out of college and not a single dang one of you was even a thought, much less being born. In the modern era, I would say, and this is entirely speculation on my part, so just forgive me for that, that about 80% of the voting public is hardwired. And what I mean hardwired, I mean 40%, Trump could get convicted of everything he's been charged with. If somehow he's able to run for the Republican nomination from prison, he would. And he'd get the nomination. And he'd get, even if every persuadable voter thought he was a crook and voted against him, he'd still get 40% of the vote. Because there's 40% of the vote that was a hardcore Republican that will not vote for a Democrat no matter what. And maybe he's in prison, but it was a Democratic president that put him there, and it's probably crooked. So, by God, we're going to, free Donald Trump. Seriously, that's how it breaks down. It's that simple. Likewise, Joe Biden could do everything rotten you could ever imagine. He's getting 40% of the vote. And by the way, that in itself is not a recent phenomenon. Go back through history. Carter, who at the time was one of the least popular presidents by polling data ever, still got 41%. Hell, Herbert Hoover got like 39.6%. There's a real floor in American politics. What has changed, though, is it used to be 40% hardcore Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20% that were up for grabs. That no longer appears to be the case, okay? Now it almost seems like 40% hardwired on both sides, about another 5% on each side, that if not hardwired are what we would call strong leaners. So you've got people, and I would say politically, to be honest with you, and to be perfectly transparent, I would probably fall in that tier. Would I vote for, I'm a registered Democrat, I don't think I'm giving away a state secret there. Would I vote for a Republican? Not only would I have. But all things being equal, I'm probably going to be more likely to vote Democratic for a number of reasons, mostly of social policy reasons. Shock, LGBT parent might be more inclined to support Democrats. Go figure that. That's hard to believe, I'm sure. But the point is, if there was something, really objectionable about the Democratic candidate, whomever that might be, would I consider voting for a Republican? Answer, yes. But that's a smaller percentage than it's ever been. And same true on the Republican side. You see it. If you ever see a full poll story, and when I say a full story, like New York Times, Washington Post, one of those outlets that occasionally does polling, what they'll do in addition to just giving the poll results, Bush and Gore are tied, or Trump and Biden, Biden's up 3 points or whatever, or Trump's up 1 or whatever. One of the things they'll do is they'll interview people. What they do when you get polled is they actually ask you, can you be contacted for an interview? Most people say no, but some say yes. And you'll see. I just read one today. A Democrat from Georgia, very liberal, who was like, I don't think Biden's done enough. I think he hasn't listened to the activists in his party. I think he's too conservative for a Democrat. But yeah, if it's him against Trump, I'm voting for him. Now, if it was a more moderate Republican, perhaps. That's the kind of person, well, in her case, she's pretty left, so I doubt it. But would she, if Biden was going to win in a blowout, vote for the Green Party? Almost certainly. Sure. There was another guy that said he was a Republican. He was from Arizona, swing state. Said, I'm no Biden fan, but I'm going to vote for him over Trump. Trump's a criminal. I mean, he pretty much said that. It's in today's New York Times. Now, if the Republicans were to nominate Tim Scott, or if the Republicans were to nominate Will Hurd, Ron DeSantis possibly, would that guy vote Republican? Yeah, probably. He's the 5%. And what that leaves us with is a very small window. 10%, I think that might be kind of the maximum, that are truly persuadable voters that could vote Democrat one election, Republican the next, and then go back to Democrat. Okay, that was my dad, actually, later in his life. He was actually a registered Republican and a pretty consistent Republican voter most of his life. Began to sort of moderate in the 80s, early 90s. Actually briefly registered Democrat. It was the most shocking thing I've ever seen in my life. This is when he was 73 years old, or 74. And hung out in the Democratic Party for about 2 years, and then ran right out immediately and became an independent. Not many people like that. Very few, and fewer now than there were a generation ago. So you're going to have gridlock, because you're going to have divided government in our system right now more often than not. So what does that mean? What does gridlock mean? Well, it means a few things. One, it means a slow pace of legislation, because the big ticket items are fundamental to values. I addressed it as an issue earlier because I'm a parent before I'm even a teacher, voting citizen, or whatever. Issues involving LGBT rights. Legislation gets passed if both houses of Congress agree. Well, we have a Republican House, Democratic Senate. On the issue of LGBT rights, what is a law that they could agree on? I'm not entirely sure that there is one. So legislation, particularly on hot button issues, is going to slow way down, because somebody would have to wholesale forfeit everything they believe in to make it happen. Another thing you see happen is that legislation gets used as a weapon. Famous example of this was back in 2004. Republicans controlled Congress, but at the time, both of the Democrats running for president were members of the U.S. Senate. You had Senator John Kerry, who was the nominee, and Senator John Edwards from North Carolina, who was the vice presidential nominee. So to try to get them on the run, so to speak, politically, the Republican Congress tried to pass a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. Now, it was never going to go anywhere as a law because it's a constitutional amendment. You're not going to get 37 states to ratify that. The legislation was created explicitly to put those two men on the record voting in favor of same-sex marriage at a time. I know you say today, well, what would be wrong with that? It's the law of the land, and it's not even really a political fight anymore. Okay, guys, this is 20 years ago. 20 years ago, California was voting in favor of banning same-sex marriage. Actually, it wasn't even 20 years ago. It was 15. So, different time. That particular issue, the issue of same-sex or same-gender marriage, or whatever term you want to use, marriage equality is, I think, the proper way to term it, has turned immensely in a short period of time. That's not, I don't want to say normal, but that's not your normal pace of policy shift. It's shifted very, very quickly. So going back to 2004, they put this proposal on the table just not to make it law, but really just to try to politically embarrass the two men who were running for president and vice president in an election year. This was in 2004. Now, Kerry and Edwards sidestepped that landmine. They simply made sure they were out of town campaigning on the day the vote came through. It didn't pass anyway, because you need 2/3, and that was that. The third thing you see in gridlock is increased partisanship, because every policy fight becomes a battle. And in battles, what do you want to do? You want to not lose. So it does tend to, plus, you tend to see the differences laid out more sharply during that time. Especially when you consider that in the modern era, let's look specifically here at the House, although to a certain extent this applies to the Senate and to the presidency, but really it applies more than anything to the House. There are so few competitive districts left that the only way you're going to get a genuine policy fight, like an interesting one, is if you see kind of what we have right now, which is that the margins are so small right now, way smaller than even normal. Senate 51-49. Now, Senate majorities are not like they used to be back in the Great Society and the New Deal era, but 55-45 is still fairly common. Not right now. 51-49, last Congress it was 50-50. The House, historically small majorities. Even in our modern divided times, you know, the Democrats got to 240 seats a few years back. The Republicans got to 230 and change, or you have a cushion of 15 or 20 votes. Right now, it's 222 to 213, 223 to 212. Can't remember because there was a special election. I don't remember if it was a flip or not. But it was one of those others. It was one of the two. It's either 223 to 212 or 222 to 213. So right now, you can get something theoretically liberal passed by the Senate voting for it, and then the House getting a few Republicans in competitive districts to flip because they don't want to lose in a marginal district. But the problem, of course, is there are hardly any marginal districts anymore. And so there's an incentive to be hyper-partisan. And the example I'll give here is a woman named Nancy Mace. Nancy Mace was elected originally as something of a moderate Republican out of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, why was she moderate? Well, she won the seat from a Democrat, a guy named Joe Cunningham. The district was almost perfectly 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. Well, what happened? In 2021, she wins in 2020, barely. Really close race. Most of the night actually looked like Cunningham was going to hold on. Mace wins in the end very, very, very narrowly. Well, South Carolina's redistricting process is run by the Republicans, and they redraw that district, the 1st Congressional District of South Carolina, to be way more Republican. Well, now the mask comes off. Nancy Mace no longer has to be a moderate. She can be increasingly partisan, and she has become exceptionally partisan. She went from being someone who, if I remember correctly, voted for Trump's impeachment, one of the few Republicans who did, to somebody who will defend him at all times. Why? Because now the danger for her is not getting beat by a Democrat, it's getting beat by a Republican in the Republican primary. So she has to become more partisan. This scenario is replayed all over the place on the left and the right, because there's Democrats for whom that's true as well. Used to be you had to worry about getting beat by a Republican. Now you got to worry about losing a primary to a Democrat. It's also becoming true in the Senate end because this number of swing states, as we call them, are decreasing. Florida used to be just on a knife's edge at all times. Now I think it's safe to say it leans to the Republicans. Conversely, a state like Virginia, actually Virginia may not even be a better example. Let's use a really good example, which is New Mexico. New Mexico used to be a swing state. In fact, fun fact, everyone talks about Florida in the 2000 elections, the 537 vote margin. Well, the margin by votes was actually closer in New Mexico. Al Gore only won the state of New Mexico by 366 votes. Now, the legislature is like 2/3 Democrat. All 3 members of the House of Representatives are Democrats. And 2 of those 3 districts are heavily Democratic. So, except, in the 1st and 3rd districts, your fear is losing in the Democratic primary. It's not losing to a Republican. It's going to change the way you behave. But true as well for the senators. Senators, if everything goes wrong, are still going to win that state by 5 points, and both senators are indeed Democrats. So it's going to change the way you behave. And so gridlock is going to be increased partisanship because you don't want to concede on an issue that your party base cares about. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, we're going to close with 2 quick thoughts. One is unified government any better? And so the anger over federal gridlock is a bit based on a fantasy, and the fantasy is, if only the Democrats controlled everything, boy, they'd be able to do whatever they wanted. Guys, Democrats did just control everything between 2021 and 2022, just like the Republicans controlled everything in 2017, 2018. They didn't get the Republicans got a couple big things done. The Democrats got one big-ish thing done relating to infrastructure in the wake of COVID and trying to restart the economy after the COVID disruption. The Republicans got a massive tax cut. But at the end of the day, they didn't get everything they wanted because we know, for example, that FDR issued more vetoes than any other president. And that's because truly unified government, the New Deal Great Society era, is rare. Now, some of you, the smarties among you, are like, wait a second, Singiser, you just said the New Deal is truly unified government. You said FDR issued more vetoes. That's right. Almost all of them between 1937 and 1945. That's when his Congress began to get away from him a little bit. He didn't have the overwhelming majorities. Not only that, but Southern Democrats really stopped voting with the Democratic majority a lot of the time because they had grown alarmed with FDR's more widened use of the federal government. Some of it was economic. It was a low-wage part of the country, and they'd like to keep it that way. Part of it was they feared a government big enough to make all these regulations would be a government big enough to force integration. So, point is, yeah, FDR in the New Deal, 33 through 35, was a truly unified government. They had massive majorities in the Congress. At one point, the Democrats had 350 seats in the House to like 88 Republicans. The Senate was 76 to 20. Okay? Yeah, in that, you can get whatever you want out of the government. Because even if some of your Democratic voters or your Democratic members bail, you've got so many you can still pass anything you want. Same thing was similarly true in the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson deals with first of all, wins a huge re-election in 1964 over Barry Goldwater, just a thumping. I think he gets 62% of the vote to Goldwater's 36 or 37. But also, there are over 300 Democratic members of the House to only 130 Republicans. The Senate's 66 to 34. You can be able to pass pretty much everything you want outside of constitutional amendments, and you even have a fighting shot at those. Well, what do we have right now? I just told you, 51 and 223. What that means is, in our two-party system, you have great variety within the party. Now, I will say, and this is an important point for an AP government student to know, not as much as there used to be. When I started tracking elections, which was when I was in college, so roughly 30 years ago, there were Democrats in the Congress that were unambiguously more conservative than some of the Republicans. So you had Northeastern Republicans that, one that comes to mind is John Chafee, who was a senator from Rhode Island, who was more liberal on pretty much every issue than a Southern Democrat like Richard Shelby, who would eventually, by the way, become a Republican, and is still in the U.S. Senate to this day. He's been there since 1986. So that's largely gone. In fact, it's very hard for me to think of a Democratic office holder who is more conservative than a sitting Republican. They get close. Joe Manchin obviously is the most conservative Democrat in the Congress, Senator Manchin of West Virginia, but there's not a Republican that's more liberal than him. There just isn't. The one that would probably become closest, probably, he says with no confidence whatsoever, would be somebody on the order of one of the upstate New York Democratic members of the House. Or maybe one of the New Jersey members of the delegation, or something along those lines. There just aren't very many of them. Hey, dogs are mad. You'll get that. Sometimes dogs get mad. Anyhow, so point is that you need truly unified government to fade the part of your party's delegation that is not ideologically pure to the party, which has almost always existed. Like I said, really only in the last 20 years. There are charts and grids that show this. Actually, one I think that's on one of the practice AP exams shows this. That, 50 years ago, there was pretty good overlap between the most conservative Democrats, who were almost all Southern, and the most liberal Republicans, who were almost all Northeastern. What's happened since then? Our parties have, to a certain extent, realigned. Southern conservatives are now almost entirely Republican, where they used to split between the Republican and the Democratic Party. Likewise, those liberal Northeasterners have almost all become Democrats. So that cross-pollination, if you will, no, doesn't really exist anymore. So with that in mind, you need a pretty sizable majority because there's just enough overlap still that it's going to be hard to find a Senate piece of legislation that Joe Manchin and the most liberal senators, say Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin or Ed Markey from Massachusetts, is going to support. But you need to do that to get anything passed. So unified government may be no better because, to be honest with you, at the end of the day, do we really have it? Even when we do? And the answer is we really don't. That's why a lot of liberals, I thought, were a little out of line complaining about that Joe Biden's first 2 years as president. They didn't do enough. You're dealing with a 220-seat House majority, which means if 6 House members bolt because they're afraid because the district back home is got enough Republicans to make them nervous, which was, still true. There's not as many as there used to be, but there's still some. When you're only talking about 6 districts out of 435, yeah, those still exist. Likewise, you have senators representing states like Montana, Ohio, West Virginia, who are in states that were carried by Donald Trump. How eager are they going to be to vote for very liberal pieces of legislation when they may have to go up for re-election? Joe Manchin in West Virginia is up in 2024. Sherrod Brown of Ohio, 2024. John Tester, Montana, in 2024. Here you go, right? So that's the nature of our system. Lastly, I will make a case for gridlock. This will not take long, because there's not a lot of great things you can say, but there's a few. Number one, divided government forces both sides to check each other's most basic, worst instincts. In 1996, there was a great ad, a really smart, really effective ad, run by the Republican Party. And it was really smart and really effective because it did something pretty extraordinary in that it admitted that their presidential candidate was going to lose. And that was Bob Dole. Bob Dole, who'd been a longtime senator, a World War II hero, was down deeply in the polls to President Bill Clinton, who's seeking re-election. So with about 3 weeks to go in the campaign, this was October of 1996, they began running an ad nationally. It was called the blank check ad. And it was a left-handed person writing check after check after check. Bill Clinton, for those of you who did not know, left-handed president. And this kind of spooky voiceover guy, not so spooky, maybe foreboding, maybe a better word, comes over this check being written and says, "The elections are coming in several weeks. And the question America must ask itself, do you want to give Bill Clinton a blank check?" And then it went through all these super liberal policies. If Bill Clinton gets a Democratic Congress, they'll do this, they'll do that. Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. That's for the Ghostbusters fans out there. And the idea was, you want to keep a Republican Congress to keep Bill Clinton from going overboard. And it worked. Democrats who thought for sure they were going to at least take the House didn't. They did gain seats, but not enough to take over the House. And they did not take over the Senate that they thought they had a decent shot at. In fact, I think they only gained 1 seat. So that means the converse would also be true. One thing I will say, without knowing anything about what the next presidential election outcome will be, is if it looks like Donald Trump's going to win, that is the worst news in the world for Kevin McCarthy and for Mitch McConnell. Because I do not have a picture of people trusting Donald Trump enough as president to say, oh, what we need to do is we need to give him a bigger Republican majority in the Congress. It's possible, but it's highly unlikely. And we saw that in 2020, actually. The Democrats actually lost seats in the House. Because ultimately, and not a few either, I want to say they lost 10 or 12 seats in the House. Because a lot of I think, well, I want Joe Biden to beat Trump, but I don't know that I want Democrats running everything. The Senate, on the other hand, they did claim, but very narrowly. Literally came down to a an overtime election, the runoffs in Georgia. And they had to win both of them, and by God, to a shock of everybody, they did. Now, I will say that was in the middle of Trump's very vocal protest against the election, and it was the day before the January 6th events. So those probably played a role in the Georgia Democrats doing as well as they did. But like I said, the converse is also true. If it looks like Trump's inevitably going to win in the year 2024, the Democratic odds of winning the Congress go up dramatically. Not because we particularly love Democrats, but that percent of voters who support Republicans more often than not but have qualms, even if those are the voters who, if they see that Trump's going to win, they're not a Trump guy, they're voting Democrat, where they might have otherwise voted Republican for the House. Second, divided government in theory should produce more centrist legislation. This is especially true for legislation that has to be passed annually. Key example of that, federal budget. Federal budget has to be authorized every single year. I don't know how many of you knew that, but that's true. So, at some point, they're going to have to meet in the middle. We're seeing that right now. That is again, as I record the summer 2023, one of the things that's happening behind the scenes is a fight over the budget, because they have to have one. Government goes in default if it doesn't pay its bills. More basically, and I'll close with this thought very, very quickly, one can argue divided government's exactly what the framers wanted when they created the concept of separation of powers. If they didn't want there to be interplay between the branches and fighting between the branches, they would have created a parliamentary system. They didn't. And we have to assume that there is a explicit reason why they did not, and that is that they did not trust the executive nor the legislature to completely run the table in the form of policy production, so they wanted them to have to play off each other. So you could argue that gridlock is exactly as the framers intended. Okay, coming toward the tail end of the presidency, but not the tail end of the executive branch. Got one more set of notes on the presidency, and then we'll get into part 2 of the executive branch, which is the federal bureaucracy. But as it relates to the issue of divided government, we are done. Vaya con Dios. Enjoy your day.